Randolph, let me ask you about that point, because we're sitting here in your beautiful library, books collected over a lifetime of experience. We meet each other regularly at conferences all over the world, and it's always a pleasure. And within that environment, it's easy to believe that men like us, people like us, with others like us, have solutions to the world. We can find ways of discussing things in a civilized manner. And then you look outside into the real world. And rather than creating a discussion and a dialogue worthy of the 21st and 22nd century, it feels like we're going back to the 19th century. We're going back to statism. We're going back to borders. We are building walls. We are seeing international institutions, global institutions, which we've depended on for the last 50 years, being broken down and torn apart. We see the rise of a new empire coming out of China, which has always believed itself to be the natural leader within the world. We see what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history being shown to be a complete fallacy. So how do you square what you know as an intellectual, as a thinker, as a leader, with the reality on the ground in the political sphere?
This is a question which is so important for the globe, and I don't think the global community has any consistent answer or perspective on this. There are different attitudes, different approaches. Let me just mention something that I think perhaps relates to an earlier point we made, and that is every era, every point in history we see ourselves as transformational, as an era that has no comparison. And I think in that sense, your reference to what we call the populism, the rising of the walls, the dislike of our leaders, the bubbles that we see our leaders working in that have no relevance to us, the fragility of the economy, etc. I mean, that is real. And let me just talk about things that I find very disconcerting. I think the first thing is we are facing transformative change that whatever the populist concern, whatever the elitist sense, the fact of the matter is, and what happens when you have global indebtedness where someone pulls the plug, where the whole global economy really no longer functions. There is no basis for financial, economic intercourse. So the question here is, populism, elitism, whatever, are faced with problems and dilemmas that no one had ever anticipated. Now, the reason I mention that is, if, for example, the assumptions about what our world and where our world is heading confronts then something like global indebtedness, the world will change so profoundly that the walls just will have no relevance, that the assumptions of the elites will, if you like, have to be totally transformed. I think really where we are is to say that whatever the global specter that we have now, it only takes a minor change to destroy all the assumptions, whether they are of the elites or the populists, in one fell swoop. This is the fragility of the world. It's not the reverting back to the state-centric system. It is not, if you like, having the dominance of an elite. It is that one factor that transforms everything and all our assumptions. And that is where I think the world is now, on that fringe.
The problem is that the transformational change will probably be catastrophic, cataclysmic. And undoubtedly, I think certainly my view in many is, it will not be on the good side, it will be on the negative side. It will be a breakdown, whether it might be through disease, whether it might be through climate change, maybe it might be through just, they're now talking about space weather. You know, if we had the whole of our communication systems taken out, what would the world look like? So to bring up sort of as a summation, where are we now? We know there's potential, we know there's opportunities. Is humanity as a whole at a state where it can move forward and take advantage of those opportunities, or will it continue making stupid decisions that will affect ourselves and the generations to come?
My answer is that there are ways out. And there are a multitude of things that one should be looking at. Let me just throw a few at you. Our education system, for all intents and purposes, perpetuates the stovepipes, the singularity of thinking, the linear process that is one of the dangers that we face in all societies around the world. I think we have to look at our education system as a way of fostering more creative thought, fostering what I've been calling greater sense of anticipation, the agility. And I think one really needs to think about that. You know, there's something called the African Leadership Center, which is based in Nairobi, but also here in London. And one of the things that we're looking at is, how can we introduce in the universities around Africa courses that, for leadership, that have nothing to do with hierarchical structures, but have more to do with how you think. How should you be taking in different possibilities about the future, and what would you do about that? So the first point is, I think we have to look at education. You know, I mentioned earlier my concern about the international organizations that we have. And I think, for example, if you take a look at the state-centric systems that we now have as international organizations, they're not adequate. They will not deal with the kinds of flexibility that we need. They will not bring in the right collaborative partners. They do as a kind of second afterthought. But we need the private sector. We need the state sector. We need the non-state actors. We need regional organizations to have a mechanism in which they, and this can be done, in totality define what needs to be done. And I think changing of the way we look, the way we use international organizations is a second point that I'd want to raise. I think a third issue is that, in a sense, and without in any way trying to say we should rely more on technology, but one of the things that we do find is artificial intelligence, quantum computing, will now give us a capacity and a capability to really understand the interactive complexities that we will have to face to deal with the world, which I think you well describe, and that is possibly on the precipice, which way to save ourselves. And I think that is another. I do think, and this is a slightly negative way of taking a look at this, but I think as we move into outer space and more realize that we are all dependent upon cyber systems, and eventually, I would hope, at solar-based electric power energy, that it would be a mistake for anyone to try and dominate. And we're all dependent upon that outer space context. So I think there are things we can do. I think there are attitudes we can promote. I think there are insecurities that might, if you like, have a gelling factor. But it's not going to be easy. There'll be tremendous resistance. But if we don't go down that way, I think we face a very grim future.